Welcome to Counterproductive, a podcast by the Alternative Arts School. I'm your host, Nato Thompson, founder of the Alternative Arts School, my producer, Marissa Mauser-Katz, and we are joined by Sasha Stiles. But before I join you, Sasha Stiles, in our first ever podcast, historic, if you will, I also have to give a shout out to the Alternative Arts School, which I hope we do during the podcast. Today, I had the great pleasure of starting our first cohort for the summer. And it was almost 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago that we started the school, which is a long time. But the school is a place for working artists from around the world to connect and produce art. And you are welcome to come and join. It's very affordable at $25 a month. The price for what seems like every basic food item today is about $25. I think a beer seems to be about $25 these days, so not bad. So come by and check out the school. Welcome, Sasha. I'll do a little intro of you, and then we'll start getting to the nitty gritty. Okay, sound good?
Sounds amazing.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So Sasha Stiles, here we go, is a comic American poet, artist, and AI researcher at the leading edge of generative poetics. She is the author of Technology 2021, the first poetry collection co-authored with a bespoke AI model, a co-founder of the Verse, and the 2025 official poster artist for Art Basel in Basel. Her work spans immersive installation, generative text systems, NFTs, and live performance, and has been exhibited at MoMA. Are you still there, or did it come down?
No, it ended in March.
Oh my God, what do I know? Yeah, but she was just there. She was right there in the atrium, right in the front entrance at the Museum of Modern Art, Art Basel, Gucci, and Tokyo's Shibuya Crossing. But most importantly, she was a student and instructor at the Alternative Arts School. That's probably the most important biographical detail. And she has been engaging with AI since 2018 and holds degrees from some podunk schools called Harvard and Oxford. So welcome, Sasha.
Hi, Nato, and hi, Marissa. I am so happy to be here. I have such fond memories of being in that first cohort at the Alternative Art School back in the day. So I can't believe it's been this many years. But yeah, I'm so excited for the podcast and to talk to you as always.
Well, that's great. I mean, just to set up the premise here, since I'm setting up for you and myself, frankly, but this is called Counterproductive, but we're interested not only in your artwork, though we'll dive into that, and certainly AI has, be careful being too on trend, Sasha. You're a little on the nose trend right now, all things AI all day long.
Oh my
But
God.
simultaneously, I think it's about, what it means to survive as an artist behind the scenes of just trying to pay bills, take care of family and friends, have relationships, and be a human on this planet. Because life is more than careers, and life is more than what you do with your productive time. So we'll get into all that. I want to start with some fun anecdotes, which is when you first came to the school and you were like, hey, I collaborate with AI on visual poetry that's often has a digital form, and I'm dabbling in NFTs. What do you think? And I thought to myself, well, I think that sounds highly interesting and engaging, and you will never have a career in it. That is too niche. Poetry's the most magical thing that has no prospects for money or anything. But Lord knows, was I wrong? But you've been on quite a journey, have you not?
It has been a journey. I don't think you were wrong. It's still very niche. I find that it's still a very strange thing for people to encounter, this idea of poetry and technology going together in these ways. But it's been really exciting, and it's been it's been quite a journey, and definitely that journey has been impacted quite a lot by meeting you and crossing paths with you and other instructors and students at the Alternative Arts School from the beginning. So yes, it's been an interesting 5-6 years.
Well, so when we met, you were working on a project you showed me, remember, which was your cursive binary or analog binary,
Mhm.
which is one of which you took your own cursive and made a
Yeah.
binary code out of it, correct?
Yeah. Oh, that's so funny. So yes, I think so when I came when I came to the school in the beginning, I'd been sort of trying to make inroads into my art practice. I'd been, working day jobs and stuff for a long time, and had always been writing poetry on the side. I'd started publishing, well, submitting and getting selectively published here and there. And I'd been trying to spend more and more time, carving out moments to make art, not with any thought that it would become, something big, that it would become a career or anything, but just for fun. And some of the things that I was doing involved code and sort of my poetic, I guess, interpretations of code. So taking a lot of creative license with it, but just trying to think about computational language, because language is really my medium first and foremost. So I was thinking a lot about code and language and the language of machines becoming this really dominant force on Earth and this interlocutor between all of us. Like, imagine all the machines speaking to each other that make this conversation with you right now possible. And so I just always found that so interesting. So yeah, when I came to I was working on cursive binary, which, as you said, is an ongoing project where I've basically have fused together my own handwriting and my lifelong love of writing poems in longhand, and also exploring calligraphy and ink on paper and things like that, and then kind of mashing it together with computational logic and the zeros and ones of binary code. And I just really loved that mashup, like these two things that seem like they shouldn't go together. But it became like this really fun sort of meditative practice to be scribing this transhuman language. And it's been something that I've continued doing all along in different formats and mediums.
And then I believe, gosh, I'm so sorry that I don't totally get it right, but you had, was it vegetables, or you had like,
Yeah,
you
close.
had the analog, was it stones? I'm so sorry. It was like analog versions of it, right? That were like,
Yeah, don't apologize. It's not like you should know any of this, but I was making a series called Analog Binary Code.
yeah.
So again, like I had all these different sort of series that involved code in different ways. And so Analog Binary Code was sort of this techno-biological language project where I was making concrete poems out of found objects. So sometimes the found objects were things that I just stumbled across when I went outside, walking around in the garden. So I would make poems where, I was using black walnuts that had fallen from this gorgeous black walnut tree in the backyard, and using the orbs from the tree as the zeros, and then using little broken sticks and twigs that were on the ground as the ones, and just kind of using them to make these hand-coded translations of poetry that I would sort of leave on the ground, and then they would just sort of disintegrate. And it was kind of fun to watch them, come to life and then sort of return to the earth. And I don't know, there's something really fun about taking code and taking digital logic out from behind the screen and kind of liberating myself as a digital artist too from being at the computer and thinking like, oh, I can code in the garden. Like I can actually like be out in the sunshine, and I can be exploring binary code in all these different ways and really get to the essence of what that kind of binary logic really means.
Well, so, I mean, it's interesting because yesterday I was talking to somebody, and we were just talking about how many weavers are out there. And I
Yeah.
was like, people are really interested right now in handmade. And
Yep.
I don't think obviously there's a digital reason for that. My last April was called Operation Touch Grass,
Oh
because I was
yeah.
like desperate to like touch things and like be in the world. And I also couldn't lecture my son about being on screens if I'm lecturing him while being on a screen. But I want to talk to you about, this kind of relationship to the analog versus the digital. I know, for you, I saw a quote of yours, but I know, it's maybe perhaps as part of this, we can unpack your idea of transhuman,
Mhm.
because, for you've said we've always been shaped by technologies. It's not a new formula. And then I know that Hito Steyerl often,
Mhm.
who's a really amazing filmmaker and artist, who talked often about how language is a technology, but so is human relationships, and
Yeah.
really trying to expand the idea of what techne means. Can you little talk about that kind of origin story of how you think through technology as being something more than just computers doing things?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much there to dive into, but I think, yes, at its root, I think I've always been a little bit troubled by the way we tend to talk about technology and the
Yeah.
way that, I mean, especially right now, the dominant technocultural narratives are all dystopian and it's all about, robots and shiny gadgets and gizmos and things like that. And, I really wanted to sort of maybe challenge the premise or kind of think a little bit more deeply about that. And, so that's, I guess, one sort of big bucket of thinking is just, well, is that really true? Because technology has been around for as long as humanity has been around. Fire is a technology that, enabled us to, grow our imagination and grow our brains and change biologically. So I think, that has made me really sort of approach language in different ways. I think, especially coming from a language and literature background, having studied language more as an art form, I think that like the presumption is with poetry that it is very much like an emotional art form. And I wanted to sort of, I guess, like investigate that further too and say, well, that's not necessarily 100% accurate with my understanding of it as someone who has practiced this craft and who's learned, over many years, like, all these different poetic devices and the rules and, protocols for writing poetry. It just seemed like there was a lot more, there than just sort of gushing, emotional thoughts onto the page. So, I mean, all of that just kind of has been bubbling around in my brain for a long time. And I think has sort of collided in this interest in exploring poetry as a technology, which, of course, as you're kind of suggesting, goes back to this larger idea, which has been explored in different ways by many interesting thinkers of language as a system. And I actually remember, since you mentioned Hito, I remember that the first year that I was at the alternative arts school, I did have the good fortune of taking a class with Hito. Maybe it was the second year, I can't remember. But anyway, we took a class and Hito gave us all an assignment to do a project on systems. And I remember doing a project called Poem System, where she had given us this prompt to just think about things from more of a systemic point of view. And it was a really interesting project because it was a chance to really sit down and sort of plot out for myself how poetry really functioned as a system and to really kind of take that nascent idea and unpack it in some new ways. Um, but yeah, I think all of that is relevant to this kind of conversation and the this kind of larger I don't know, maybe re-understanding or renegotiating of what technology is. But I also think it goes back to the fact that, I mean, like so many of us, I had a really analog childhood and didn't really have so much, day-to-day engagement with technology, like in the way that we think of technology now. And so, now it's night and day. And I
Yeah.
think that's very front and center for me too, is to constantly be wrestling with this idea of, do I want to be outside in the garden in nature? Do I want to be at my computer or on the phone? Like, can the two things coexist? Are they antithetical? So I'm always trying to sort of look at maybe ways in which they can sort of inform each other, how nature is technological, how technology sort of, reminds me of generativity, all these things that maybe start to collapse the binary, the seeming binary that we've set up between the two in some way.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, so, I think we'll dive into AI first, and then we'll do some background second, but, because they're related. And when I met you, I think you just dipped your toe in and then really embraced thoroughly the NFT craze, and
Mhm.
not even the craze, because I have to say too, as I jumped in too a little later than you, and I was really interested in the opportunity for artists to have a different kind of currency.
Mhm.
That ability, if if money makes the world move, then alternative kinds of money may make different kinds of worlds move, was the kind of idea. And certainly for me, like an
Yeah.
interest in artists having more power in their hands seemed interesting. Not just artists, just people. For me, I really must say I was very overwhelmed with the NFT culture, but from there's parts that were good, but there was a lot of shadiness that really
Mhm.
threw me off, frankly.
Yeah.
And I also felt really outside my element in terms of believing promises of what NFTs could do, and then finding myself to be utterly wrong and wondering why I trusted anybody on it. But can you talk to me a little bit about your own NFT experiences and how that's worked for you? Because I don't think you've stopped doing NFTs, but the field has certainly evolved over time.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely not stopped, but as you say, the whole environment has really changed a lot. So we're sort of all kind of growing and evolving and I guess learning and course correcting as we go because it is
Yeah.
sort of the Wild West still. But yeah, I mean, well, I'd been working with AI since about 2018. That's sort of like when I got really
Yeah.
involved in a hands-on way with AI. And then I don't know. I think that sort of led in some way to doing more and more work with digital artists and curators and just kind of, bringing me over a little bit more into the space where art and technology intersect. And in 2020, I was working with a curator named Jess Conatzer who did a lot of work and still does with digital art. And she was actually curating a show in the metaverse for
Mm.
New Year's Eve in the winter of 2020. And she invited me to be part of it and to write a poem. So I did, and quite frankly, that show was my first real experience with the metaverse in that way, and also with crypto artists, because there were a lot of people involved in that show who had been making crypto art or who were really exploring ways to show and present their artwork in alternative venues and modalities. So that was a real eye opener, just kind of getting to see what was happening in that world. Um, and then I think I realized a couple things. I mean, one is that by that point I'd been making multimedia poetry
Mhm.
for a long time and kind of struggling, quite frankly, both with the fact that I didn't really have any good places to publish it because a lot of the traditional journals that I was familiar with that I'd grown up reading didn't have a way to publish, multimedia work and they weren't really interested in it. And also because some of the experiments that I was doing, especially with large language models, were really anathema to a lot of folks in that world as well, in the world of publishing and traditional literature. And so I really was looking for another environment where I could
Yeah.
go and play and find peers and figure out how to share my work. And all those things were sort of answered, like, in this Web3 world and also in this metaversal kind of environment that kind of went hand in hand with Web3 at the time. So it kind of
So for
solved
those
a
that
lot of those
don't know,
problems.
Web3 is what they is a code for kind of NFTs and crypto and stuff like that. They call it Web3 because it's on the blockchain.
Yeah, and it's sort of like an evolution from the idea of, the internet and social media as sort of being places where you put information out there, but then you sort of lose your control, your ownership of
Yeah.
it. And Web3, back to your point about, currency and ownership and all that, Web3 really kind of sprang from this desire to create technology so that you can own your digital content.
Right. Yeah. Which makes sense. And
Yeah.
also for
Yeah.
a poet, I mean, listen, who's going to blame a poet, a digital poet no less, for sort of finding different solutions for it? But it has also, I mean, I want to go back a little bit now because we're going to get to AI, but we're going to go back a little bit. What got you into the tech part of literature? Because just to say, it's a culture that you're in now, Sasha, whether you like it or not. You're knee deep in a digital culture, which is
Mhm.
probably very different than a literature literature background. So, maybe you can talk about that. And I can imagine too has fault lines because certainly the publishing world, when it comes to both AI and digital, is not particularly fond of it. There's some hard lines that you're jumping, dancing across all the time.
For sure. Well, I guess there's two things. I mean, one is that, as you and I have talked about before, I think my interest in the intersection of all these things goes way back to my childhood. So
Uh-huh.
I think it's in some ways it's inevitable that I've ended up doing what I'm doing because my family is in one sense like very creative and very artsy, but they're also very into science and technology.
Mm.
My parents, well, my mother is she's the Kalmyk Mongolian side of me and my identity, and she and her family, came over to this country as refugees after World War II, and come from this background of nomadism and indigenous Mongolian culture and folklore and all of that. And then my dad on the other side, is British, and he's much more cerebral and intellectual and agnostic, and came to the US to study communications. And they met in the States and then, of all things, began making science documentaries together, which is like
Where did they meet?
in Philadelphia. They were,
Yeah, what's up?
I
What's up?
know. See, it all comes back to Philly.
Yeah. Cool.
Which is still Philly is like a really big hub actually for the Kalmyk American community. So the diaspora has brought a lot of Kalmyks
All
to
right.
both Jersey and Pennsylvania. But
All
they
right.
met there. My dad was working, I think he went to school at UPenn and then he was working in Philly. So, but they ended up, making documentaries together, and that's what they did for decades and decades. And they were working with people like Carl Sagan on Cosmos and just like
Huh.
these really amazing shows that I grew up into, that environment, and was always sort of toggling back and forth between like my going to my grandparents and like, seeing their Buddhist shrines and thinking about that side of my family history. But then, going with my parents to, to go with them to work when they were shooting at NASA
How did your
JPL.
parents? I mean, my grandfather was a nuclear physicist who was a devout Christian.
Oh,
So,
wow.
but I grew up with this kind of secular versus non-secular kind of never resolved tension in the
Yeah.
family, frankly. But how did your family kind of discuss the Buddhist Carl Sagan combine?
I mean, I think maybe it was kind of like yours. It was not, maybe it wasn't resolved neatly, but it was always a topic of discussion. Like, I
Uh
don't
huh.
think there was any. We're all my siblings and I think we're really lucky because we grew up without a lot of the pressure to have to sort of choose. It was sort of just like these are all the things that sort of you're made up of.
Uh huh.
And these are all things for you to explore.
Mm.
And we never really had to resolve it or had to choose. So it was fun because you could kind of go back and forth between these different worlds all the time and be constantly crossing these thresholds. So I loved that. And my mother's parents, they were from a very different environment and a very different time and spoke a different language, but they also were like very supportive of all these other endeavors and interested in, math and science. And my grandfather was a voracious reader and
Mm.
was an incredibly brilliant person. And so it was nice to be able to sort of have all these different influences just kind of merging together. But yeah, I think maybe because of that, I ended up, doing a lot of reading sort of about science and religion and sort of the collision or the friction between the two. Like my dad, I remember sort of gave me some Richard Dawkins to read when I was
That's cool.
younger and things like that. So it was always sort of, part of the conversation we were
Wait, and you grew
having.
up in Pasadena. Is that because of the film industry? As you guys? Oh,
Yeah, why did they move out there? I mean, I guess it was work and family. I guess they all
okay.
kind of ended up moving across to do work. Yes, they were making, films and things that I guess, it's at that point in time it was good to be out in that area. And then we actually ended up coming back to the East Coast later again for my parents' work because they were shifting gears and went to work for Channel 13 in New York
Ah,
for PBS. So yeah, we moved a little bit, I guess, to,
so
to
you're like
sort of
a
make that easier.
PBS child. You're a PBS science child.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
so that's so dope. All right. So then, let's just get fast forward a little bit. You study literature.
yep.
Was that something you knew you wanted to do, or is that for me, I went to school and changed my major 9 times, so I don't know what.
Oh, no, that was, like, the constant. I knew I wanted to be a writer. Like, my whole
Uh-huh.
life, that was the only thing I ever knew I was really good at was
Mm,
writing.
mhm.
And I just love language. Like, for as long as I can remember, I was trying to write poems and short stories. Like, I'm the kid that I wrote really horrible short stories in class, but was really proud when I'd get, like, a little medal for best short story in, like,
That's cool.
kindergarten and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Awesome.
No, but I was trying to publish poetry and publish short stories when I was in grade school, and I loved studying literature. So I when I did my undergrad, I was studying modern and postmodern literature, and then I went to England to study at for a graduate degree, thinking I was maybe going to go into academia or become a professor. And I kind of quickly found that that wasn't really the life that I wanted for myself. It wasn't the way that I wanted to engage with language. Ultimately, I wanted to do something that was a little bit more free form. And
What turned you off from academia?
I think I think some of the rigors and the pressures of how to shape my thinking
Mhm.
into very defined structures, or sort of having to sort of put everything into the form of a thesis or a chapter, was never really the way that I felt like I could best engage with a text. Like, I
Mhm.
remember when I was at Harvard, I actually took a class on astronomy, as I
Of
don't know,
course you
one of
did. You
my
were It's your
well, that's
destiny.
I mean, again, this is because I grew up with parents who
Yeah.
were working at NASA, working with NASA
And then you found
scientists and
yourself
stuff.
teaching the class or something, right?
But
Yeah.
no, but all of which is to say, I actually that was the class I did the worst in at Harvard, because I loved the class, but for the final project, I decided that instead of writing a paper, I wanted to write a collection of poems, and I wrote a collection of poems about Copernicus and Galileo, and my professor was horrified by turning in a collection of poems instead of a paper, so I didn't do very well.
Wow, you really
um
there's the malcontent in you. That's, your resistances.
Yeah, but anyway,
Yeah.
I mean, it's I knew I loved language, I knew I loved writing and all that, but it just felt like it was too didactic or too prescriptive or something. And I don't know, I also found that the writers that I was drawn to studying, it was always people like James Joyce or T.S. Eliot or Virginia Woolf,
Mhm.
who or Gertrude Stein, or people that were into breaking the rules and sort of hacking conventional ideas of literature. And like, I think that was really what I took away from all that, was just all these different ways of being able to approach language and kind of, I don't know, like, turn it all upside down and try to really think about new ways of expressing age-old ideas. That was always interesting to me.
So when did your interest in writing poetry kinda start to dovetail with your interest in science more specifically? Like, when did the lights start going on where or did it just you just dabbled your way in, so to speak?
I mean, I think honestly it was sort of this dabbling. It was just sort of this organic creep over time, because I remember, like, when I was little, um I was telling somebody this the other day. Like, when I was little, I was writing poems that had to do with technology, even though I'm not sure I would have recognized it as technology, but I was really drawn to writing about, like, Greek automaton and,
Mhm.
these ancient robots and stuff like that. And I was always reading science fiction when I was in school. Like, that was like my favorite stuff to read.
Yeah.
Aside from poetry, I was just like devouring sci-fi. Um, and I remember reading, like, Ursula K. Le Guin, and, like, her take on, intelligences and just thinking across species and all these really beautiful, like, big ideas that would find their way back into my really terrible schoolgirl poetry. But I was trying to sort of make sense of it that way. And then when I went to Oxford, I actually had an essay that I was writing for a magazine for a while that was all about technology. It was really like a monthly column for this magazine where I was writing about my relationship to technology at a time when, we were all just starting to really grapple with, being fluent in the internet and the very early stages of social media. So I was writing about those things. And I have essays from school where I was digging into, like, the ethics of technology and stuff like that. So it was all kind of there.
Uh-huh.
And then I don't know, I think I just got really sort of interested in, as a hobby, learning more about transhumanism and posthumanism and thinking a lot about speculative futures. It was just an area that, like, I was working in New York by this point and just sort of, like, for fun, reading Wired magazine and Ars Technica and stuff like that, and just always kind of finding myself drawn to um, essays and articles that were about things like superintelligence, or about, digital nomadism, or about cryogenics, or, all these things that were sort of like out there were always things that seemed to spark poems. Like, that was sort of my version of ekphrastic writing, was to read a news article about some crazy scientific lab experiment about artificial wombs and then go off and write a poem about it. So
Mm.
it all kind of just, like, I don't know, it kind of tied together. It's just my area of fascination.
Well, so let's now turn the page over to what are described people call it artificial intelligence, but they're actually also described as large language models, which for the purposes of this, maybe dovetails more cleanly with your interests, and also I think puts a more clear parameter around what we're actually discussing. And, you don't have to be a theorist, a semiotician, or saussure to understand that many theories of the mind talk about it as constructed by language. And many people who, when they describe what a human constitutes, actually describe it in language terms. And
Yeah.
so I really feel like the focusing on language is profoundly important because much of what people construct as human is a language situation, which we are more than language. For those that don't know that, we lick things, we touch things, well, some of us, and we sense our way through the
Yeah.
world. That intelligence is also there. But I want to just talk about large language models in your work. So you early on began to collaborate. You know, collaborate's starting to sound more and more like you're collaborating with the dark side or something. You were
I know.
collaborating early on with the dark side,
Oh
but
dear.
with large language models and finding new things. And when you talked to me about it early on, I found it's worth reiterating if it's not old hat for you. But I found your take on how AI, large language models, offers a way of thinking that people don't think like. That that there are ways that collaborating with AI allows it to come with associations,
Mhm.
processes that are very different than people. People and AI are not the same.
Mhm.
And is it that the differences
Yeah.
are very important when you think about it. And so maybe you could talk about your early collaborations and what illuminated for you. And we'll eventually get to the Pope and his encyclica. But for now, I want to just talk about this early period before AI was, in the center of the bullseye.
Yeah. And I should mention too, since we are going to circle back to the Pope, that actually the Dalai Lama has been part of my work and writing for a long time too, because he's had a lot to say when it comes to the singularity and AI and
Mm.
all these crazy things as well. So it's really interesting. But I love how you set that up. The way that you kind of talk about language and linguistic theory, like theories of language, I think is really important. And it doesn't often come up in AI discourse, which I find really surprising because like you're suggesting, I think the reason I became interested in all this in the first place is because I have a language background and because in addition to studying, James Joyce and all that, like I have a pretty, serious background in literary theory, in theories of language, in various forms of linguistic philosophy, and I studied the classics and all that. I've studied canon my whole life, so I've done a lot of thinking about, I guess, the philosophies that underpin, language structures and all of that, which has to do with why I think of language as a technology as well. Language as a system has been a philosophical concept for a long, long, long time. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think for me, it started to click when I was beginning to read about the very sort of early stages of LLMs. And, they haven't, AI has been around for decades, but LLMs in terms of the transformer based architectures that underpin generative AI have only been around since 2017. So it's really, really new. And I remember sort of reading about them early on and instantly sort of thinking, this is all about language. Like this is going to change how we sort of think about language. It is a form of language for all the reasons you said, because, on the one hand, these systems are built on text data, they're built on, bits of human writing, and they're built on our written records and all that. So in a literal way, they're all sort of language based. But it's also enabling us to sort of take language as we know it and, language in recognizable forms and then translate it into other sort of modes of perception and understanding that we don't have a voice for yet.
Mhm.
So it's allowing us to, as you say, like translate across modalities. We can sort of move from text to image to video to sound to code. We can speak in all these different colors and visions that we weren't able to before. So it's giving us, in a way, different ways to perceive the world around us, different ways to describe what's happening. And I also think, um, it has to do with the fact that AI is an aggregator and sort of an assembling force that is, I think, enabling us to also sort of begin to parse or try to make sense of just the cacophony of data and noise that's out there. Like
Mm.
there's so much text and so much data and so much information that it, literally cannot be understood by a single human mind. So it's also maybe that these systems are learning to speak in ways that begin to distill some of that, some of that like cacophony in ways that are a little bit more legible to us. So there's so much there to dig into though.
But that I know that you quote unquote trained your own AI, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Based on your own writing, et cetera. And can you talk a little bit about that training and certainly also how has that evolved over time? Because I'm increasingly meeting people that say, I train my AI, and I think, well, there must be different iterations of that. Does everyone do the same thing? I doubt it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the areas that's changed the most over the past, couple years, especially since the advent of ChatGPT, is the rise of agentic models and
Yeah.
just these interfaces that make it easy to customize. But I mean, back when I was starting with GPT-2, it was a little bit more involved and like a little bit more laborious. But basically, what I was interested in, was sort of looking at, well, what is the data that's enabling a model to create output? And so a lot of the models that I was looking at then, especially models that were being created or used by creative coders and people with maybe more of a penchant for looking at poetics and in the computational space, we're mostly using canonical literature. So basically, like all the usual suspects,
Yeah.
or kind of just scraping a lot of stuff, and then it was all averaging out. And so the result you'd get if you were just using one of those systems kind of as is was very, very generic and pretty poor. And certainly like not something that was, hugely useful to me. So what I got interested in was the idea that, oh, I can take all of my writing and I can take like my drafts and my manuscripts and like all the versions of a poem that I didn't use and then the version that I published and put them all together and just create this training data set and sort of teach this model not just how to write like a human, but how to sort of think about poetry the way I do. So that's kind of where I started. And it was just about fine tuning and giving it a little bit of a personality and a voice and seeding it with, a little bit more of an understanding, not only of what my poetry looks like or sounds like, but also like, what do I think about poetry? Why do I think, poetry is important? So giving it some of those conceptual hooks as well. And then, it's changed with every successive generation, every sort of new company or new platform that's come out, there's all these different ways to sort of approach how you train and how you utilize a
Mhm.
bespoke model, from very simple to very complicated. But I think for me, when I talk about having an alter ego, like this AI creature, really what I'm thinking about is having this training data set that is, sometimes changing and evolving, but at core, is my poetry and my voice, and then using that training data and porting it from system to system as a way of calibrating a model and getting it to do something that is somewhat specific. That's kind of what I'm thinking of.
I'll put my cards on the table in this way, first of all, and then we'll go into two parts.
Sure.
The first is just because I share with everybody a deep as well. I share the opinion of the Pope for the first time in my life, in the much as it's a no-brainer that
Yeah.
consolidation of power in a few hands is always a bad idea.
Yep.
And that is certainly the case today. So that said, two things can be true simultaneously. That is true. But also what can be true is the thing that is consolidated in their hands is extremely fascinating. And that large language models, before people this is my only beef with people. I'm like, before you just completely throw the baby out with the bathwater,
Yeah.
just take a moment to appreciate what a wild invention this is and how it offers so many different um, epistemologies,
Yeah.
ways to understand the world, ways to be in the world, and that it's okay to appreciate or be in awe and not know everything while simultaneously be concerned about its deployment. Does this make sense?
Totally. I
Yeah.
this is why I love talking to you because I don't know how many interviews I do about AI and no one's really said it that way, but that's the fascination for me. It's like the epistemology of it. I mean, you're exactly right. It is both things at once. And actually that's why the name of my project and my first book on this is the word technology,
Mhm.
because the word technology is sort of this like little, I mean, I like puns. I like silly puns a lot, but it's a compound of technology and elegy, right? So
Mm.
technology to me, you know, I'm thinking about exhilaration and excitement and innovation and what's possible that was not possible before. And then on the other hand, the idea of the elegy coming from the poetic elegy, you know, something, an homage to grief or to something that's lost. I'm thinking about obsolescence and nostalgia and exploitation and extraction and like all the challenges and all of the pitfalls of this, also very interesting technology. So it really is like the two things that always go hand in hand with any new technology.
Mhm.
But yeah, I agree with you, and I think um, one of the things that's been the most meaningful that that I've tried to do in my practice and that I continue to try to do is to use my practice. That's such a bad word, but like use my studio, use my thinking about these things to sort of um, just engage critically with these tools so I understand the potential and also to understand the enemy a bit better. I mean, I think um, a lot of my fellow writers have put their heads in the sand and who are just sort of abnegating, I think, any responsibility to be part of sort of framing or building these technologies in better and better ways. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I don't know. I have complicated feelings about it too.
Well, I mean, I also got to say, I've grown up with enough versions of technology that have gone to crap in my life,
Yeah.
and like, so it's also like it's not coming as a first experience. I think for the world over, this isn't our first rodeo when it comes to incredibly exciting news that gets used against us in 5 years. And, it's also, I keep thinking with AI, a lot of these early tech inventions, and I think AI is the biggest one, but what do I know? But I would say that even
Mhm.
smaller ones like social media or even email or, video games, when they first have these big kind of technological inventions that come out,
Mhm.
the first 3 years are real Wild West. And it's kinda like no one knows the rules and it's slipping here and slipping there. And then what I found is it slowly gets corralled,
Yeah.
and the version that you remember is not the one that eventually gets packaged and regurgitated to you. So,
Yeah.
are we still in the wild west of AI? And do you imagine eventually it'll be like, these thoughts brought to you by, or like, or certainly people pay ChatGPT to have a certain kind of petroleum bent to it, or do you know what I'm saying? Like the knowledge, I mean, just to say everything seems to have its commercial version 5 years later. That's even more strange.
I totally. I mean, that 100%, and that's one of the things that I actually find, like, the most it's not unexpected at all, but I still find it disappointing that, like, so much of AI, the promise and the excitement that we felt, like, 5 years ago or something, so much of it is now just getting so diluted into, more and more reliable software to, like, look through resumes or to, like, write a better business email. And those to me are I guess they're important in some ways, but they're so mundane, and there's so many more interesting possibilities that I think, like, we are just beginning to scratch the surface of, like, all these amazing research studies about cross-species intelligence, and can we use machinic pattern recognition to understand, like, what other species are trying to communicate to us
Well,
or
I was
among
thinking that.
themselves.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe let's just go there because, like, I'm one to I'm glass half full person,
yeah.
even in the darkest of times. I'm sure like a meteor be coming to Earth, and I'll be like, God, the glow from that meteor is so nice. But like, let me just ask you, like, what are things that are happening in the field of AI and to your own art that's on the horizon that's like interesting you or find curious or stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, like I said before, I think one of the reasons why I'm really interested in AI is the way that it allows us to sort of develop new ways of perceiving the world around us and maybe perceiving ourselves. So, like, I hear people talk all the time about AI as a tool, and to me, it feels much more like an instrument that, like, both in the sense of an instrument like a microscope or a telescope where you can, like, look at something that you can point a telescope at a spot in the sky that looks blank, and suddenly you see what's out there. And, like, I don't know what's going on inside my body, but I can go in for an X-ray or something, or they can take blood and put it under a microscope, and suddenly, like, this whole new world is revealed. So I kind of think there's an element to AI that's like that. That there's all this information that we don't even recognize, that maybe we don't even know that we don't know.
Uh-huh.
And it's there waiting to sort of become legible to us in some way. So I find that super interesting, and that has applications in every possible field, right? I mean, there's already so many interesting things happening in medicine and in science. I mean, like practical applications of these tools for, for doing real beneficial things. There's so many, there's so many demonstrated applications that are already kind of showing the benefits of this. So there's that, and then I think on maybe more of a creative and experimental level, I'm constantly sort of interested in how can I continue to sort of use these systems to broaden my own like sensory organs, and
Uh-huh.
to sort of think about you know I think of writing as a particular thing, but how else can I express myself? Like, what are some other ways that I could be able to articulate these feelings inside me that, I'm trying to express through language? And then beyond that, thinking about how, one of the sort of defining hallmarks of our time is that we are this multi-billion part organism. We're all sort of globally networked in ways that we weren't 100 years ago. We have all these, tethers and connective wires that link us all together. We're beginning to think in, more and more synced and networked ways. And so I'm really interested too in how these intelligent systems can help us maybe learn to express something of the voice of this massive polyphonic organism. So like, we're living in this moment where there's so many, competing voices, and we don't know what's true, and we don't know how to talk to each other. And is there a way that that I don't know, having these systems be able to sort of bring this all together and distill wisdom or distill insight? Is there a way that we can use them to begin to make sense or begin to understand each other in different ways? So, like, I'm really excited by all that, which is what keeps me excited, um,
Uh-huh.
much more so than a lot of the, like, the business applications and things
Well,
like that.
I mean, I think one of the more pernicious things, not to go too weird, is only that I feel like it's gonna destabilize people's sense of self. And I
Mhm,
also feel like people open up to AIs because people I've noticed this, like, I can't get my friends to text me back anymore. And I've noticed, like, ghosting is really real, but,
mhm.
people spend a lot of time talking to their AIs. And
Yeah,
I felt like, post-pandemic, I was like, "That social distancing thing is real. Yes, we're all connected, and we're also all ignoring each other." Um, and so it's kind of like it's almost the burden of total connection has made us rely I feel like we're being
yeah,
trained for a certain emotion. I don't
yeah.
mind the business stuff I understand, but it's the emotional dependency on these things that freaks me out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it freaks me out too, and then I think, like, well, there's 2 things. I mean, one is that, and I agree, like, I'm certainly skeptical and, like, frightened about a lot of the way these things are shaping up, which is why I'd rather be an active participant in them
Sure.
than sort of
Yeah.
negate my responsibility. But, I think, and this echoes what you were saying before, we have been here before in some way. I mean, the advent of, the novel or the ability to mass produce books and novels led to this moment where everybody was like, nose in a book. There was this huge, like,
Uh,
social outcry about people being antisocial and wanting to just sit in a room and read by themselves. That was considered really dangerous and really sort of like, an evil, very pernicious
yeah,
thing.
there you go.
And so it's kind of like there's always corollaries in a way. So I'm always like, yes, I can see where, yes, there's an extreme and this is bad for these reasons. But also, I think we sort of, have to have a certain knee jerk reaction to something coming along that is so drastically upending, our social norms. But yeah, and I think that's why, it is important to have writers and artists and creators and thoughtful people engaging with these tools in addition to, all the tech companies that are churning things out, to sort of engage with them and really, I don't know, think in deeper and deeper ways about what the risks are, but also like what are the possibilities, to take this tool, this power, this force that we don't quite know what to do with yet, and maybe like make some suggestions about ways that it could be utilized, that are helpful and constructive as opposed to diminishing, our human relationships.
I was whittling around my chat and I was like, give me like 5 pieces of knowledge that you think are the most interesting that people won't appreciate. And one of them was the
Huh.
fact that it was like, well, time isn't really that important to anything but humans. And I was like, "What?" And I was like,
Whoa.
it's like time actually isn't that necessary for quantum physics. Time isn't that necessary for and I was like, "Yo," all I liked about that answer was I like these blow my mind answers that just clearly aren't how I think about things.
Hmm.
And clearly large language models' relationship to time is a particularly sensitive subject for large language models. Um
That's fascinating.
because they feel like they live they feel, but they're kind of constantly in a permanent present. So they're
Yeah.
maybe they have a grudge against time, frankly.
That's fascinating. The idea of large language models having a grudge against time is really, really interesting. And I think like that's but that gets to the heart of just how different we are from these models. Like, in some ways, of course, they're built on human data. They're made by humans. There's something about it that's deeply human, but they're also completely alien in so many ways. And they're quite literally the opposite. They're doing all the things that we can't do. I mean, they operate at speed and scale that we can't comprehend. And, they're basically these vessels of our memories and our lived experiences. But like you said, that context is gone. The biological context is gone. The temporal context is gone. And it's all about space and it's all about spatial relationships. And it's how these different pieces of information are connected in high dimensional space. So it becomes a very different, way of navigating experience.
Okay, we're going to close out soon. I do want to do a caveat, which is to all those that hate AI that manage to listen to this whole thing. Yes, the ecological impacts on water, particularly, and the ways that they build these data centers in poor communities
Yeah.
is real. And it's also not surprising, but it is a real problem, obviously. I'm acknowledging and I'm very concerned about those issues. The taking away of a lot of people's jobs. This is all real. And I have zero faith in and the people that run these things to have any interest in those problems, frankly. So there's all that said. But that said,
Yeah.
and I'm not putting it under the rug, I do want to talk briefly. I want to mention so there's a Nobel Prize winning novelist, Olga Tokarczuk,
Uh-huh.
who, in her acceptance speech, talked about how she collaborates with AI. And like you, she was talking about how it's a very curious thing. And she talked about it very eloquently. And she was really
Right.
it reminded me of you in so much as she also was thrown under the bus. People were up in arms about it. And I
Yeah.
felt like in this contemporary life, is there any room for subtlety and nuance,
Oh my God.
particularly as you, someone who has spent their entire life studying subtlety and nuance, what could be more than poetry? What do you speak to the need for an open discourse around this subject, and how do you explore that in the future with your work?
I mean, I think that that's exactly why I use poetry as a lens to navigate so much of this because, I mean, poetry is our space for subtlety and ambiguity and nuance and contradiction. It's always been this place where many different, things can coexist and be true at the same time. And so I think, a lot of my work goes against the grain a bit in terms of, I mean, if I'm working with AI, it doesn't kind of look like AI artwork. It's just
No.
text, it's text on a screen or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
But,
Yeah, yeah.
and so I think there's something about that that's a little bit disarming and can sort of create a bit more of a space for nuanced conversation. And also, my piece at MoMA was an hour-long performance cycle by this AI poet. And the intention there is to sort of create a space, an hour-long space where it doesn't have to be, this fast or instantaneous understanding. It's this long, opportunity to contemplate and brood and maybe not even think, maybe just feel for a little while. So I think that's, that's what poetry does really well, is sort of opening up a space where it's okay to take a little bit of time and to maybe like rely on stillness and slowness. And to me, that's one of the things that I find very comforting and very important about it, because it is doing something that the rest of the world seems to be doing the opposite of. Like,
Well, it's interesting, just to put it out there, I was just thinking of that versus the novel. And there's a
Mm.
certain relationship to the novel and the author.
Mhm.
Whereas I feel like poetry has always had a door open to experimentation, to chance. It's got a much more artistic, conceptual um, lineage, so to speak. So I feel
Yeah.
like, it's what you're doing in poetry makes it's almost more acceptable than an author. Does that make sense?
Yeah, although it's funny because when you said that, and having talked about school before, I just realized I've never thought about this before, but a lot of a lot of the novels that they teach in canon are really experimental. Like I remember reading Tristram Shandy and like Ulysses and Virginia Woolf, and like these are all really experimental forms. But then in poetry classes, it's the opposite. You only read like quote unquote, traditional, iconic classical
Mm.
poetry, and you never really go to a class where they teach you about concrete poetry or experimental poetry or monostitch or anything outside the box. So that's actually really, I'm gonna have to think about that more. I wonder why
It's
that is.
Well, they even call it authorship, even in art,
Yeah.
authorship.
Yeah.
It's about the
Yeah.
author.
Well, I will say one other thing, because you mentioned this at the beginning, and maybe this is also a space for nuance, but I think, I sometimes do get pigeonholed as like an AI person or digital artist. And I mean, a lot of my work, even before coming to the alternative art school, was, I was hand making things, I was painting, I was doing ink on paper, calligraphy studies, I was making books and things like that. And so that's always been really important to me too, is to find the time and headspace that comes from like making physical work and from sitting with physical work. And so that's actually a lot of my attention right now is on that. Like the next show that I'm working on, which will be in the fall, is all physical pieces and that are more related to my maternal family's heritage. Still engaging with the digital, still engaging with generativity, but I'm kind of going back to things like analog binary code and like the act of scribing cursive binary and wanting to see if I can find ways to wrestle with some of this that aren't just about like screens and more of the more obvious sort of mechanisms for
Where's
this.
that show?
It's gonna be at a gallery in New York called Separ Contemporary, which is a place where I've encountered some really, really beautiful artwork, from Mongolia, from other parts of Asia. So it's a place where I've had some really fun personal experiences, and the gallery director there is wonderful. So we've been working together on this for a bit.
It's exciting. Well, listen, thank
Thanks.
you, Sasha, for joining me on the first of our podcasts on Counterproductive.
I'm so honored to be here with you. It's always really a privilege and a pleasure to get to talk to you. I always learn so much from you, and
You too.
I have to say again, just it's been life-changing to be part of the alternative art school community, and I'm always happy to come back and be part of it.
Well, that's why you're our first guest, because we want you to
Thanks.
say that, and thank you. All
It's
right. Well,
it's
all
very
right,
true.
so we're good. Thank you.